There's a strange moment that happens in the human mind. The moment someone tells you not to do something, and suddenly you want it more than anything. Not because it's good for you, not because you planned it, but because something inside you refuses to be controlled. That instinct is older than logic. That's why warnings backfire, why strict rules invite rebellion, why advice often produces the opposite result, and why the most effective influence rarely gives direct commands. History is full of leaders, advertisers, and manipulators who understood this one uncomfortable truth. People don't resist persuasion. They resist being told. Reverse psychology doesn't push, provokes. It doesn't argue. It steps aside and lets the ego do the work. And once you understand how this mechanism operates, you start noticing it everywhere. In relationships, in parenting, in politics, in marketing, even in the way you talk to yourself. This video isn't about tricks or cheap manipulation. It's about a deep psychological flaw built into human autonomy itself. A flaw that makes people feel most free, exactly when they're being guided. By the end of this, you won't just recognize reverse psychology. You'll realize how often your choices were reactions, not decisions. Before we go any further, understand this clearly. This video is not here to turn you into a manipulator. It's here to expose a mechanism that already shapes your behavior every day. Because once you can see how resistance is engineered, you stop mistaking impulse for independence. Watch carefully, listen slowly, and notice your own reactions as we go. Reverse psychology only works when it stays invisible. Once it's seen, its power collapses. Let's begin. The instinct to resist there is a reflex inside the human mind that activates faster than thought. The moment control is sensed, resistance appears. It doesn't ask whether the command is reasonable. It doesn't evaluate intent. It doesn't care if the outcome would actually help. It simply pushes back. This instinct is not rebellion in the political sense. It is psychological self-preservation. A primitive alarm that whispers, "You are being directed," and the mind hates direction more than discomfort. From early childhood, autonomy becomes tied to identity. Saying no is not just refusal. It is proof of selfhood. It is the first way the ego announces its existence. I decide. I choose. I am not controlled. Reverse psychology does not create this instinct. It exploits it. When someone tells you what to want, your mind doesn't ask, "Is this correct?" It asks, "Why are they deciding for me?" That question changes everything. The suggestion becomes an intrusion. The advice becomes a threat. The instruction becomes a challenge. And challenges awaken pride. This is why direct persuasion often fails on intelligent people. The smarter the mind, the more fiercely it guards autonomy. Logic doesn't dissolve resistance. It sharpens it. The mind begins defending not the position, but the right to choose the position. This is where reverse psychology slips in. It doesn't tell the mind what to do. It lets the mind prove itself. By stepping away, by withdrawing instruction, by implying limits, it invites the ego to act in defiance. And defiance feels powerful. The choice feels free. But freedom triggered by opposition is still guided. The uncomfortable truth is this: the moment your action is a reaction, it no longer belongs entirely to you. Reverse psychology thrives in that gap. Not because people are foolish, but because autonomy is emotional before it is rational. And the ego will always choose the path that lets it feel in control, even when that path was quietly laid out in advance. When control is felt, Choice becomes emotional the moment resistance is triggered. The mind stops operating on logic. It switches to emotion. This is the part most people misunderstand about choice. They assume decisions are made by weighing outcomes, consequences, and reason. In reality, most choices are made to protect identity. And identity is emotional. When someone gives you advice, your mind does not first evaluate whether the advice is good. It evaluates whether the advice threatens your autonomy. If it does, everything else becomes secondary. Even truth, even benefit, even self-interest. This is why people ignore advice they privately know is correct. Accepting it would mean admitting influence. And admitting influence feels like weakness to the ego. Reverse psychology understands this and uses it mercilessly. It introduces a subtle emotional conflict. Not between right and wrong, but between freedom and control. The suggestion is framed in a way that activates pride. You probably wouldn't want this. This isn't for someone like you. Most people can't handle it. These statements are not commands. They are challenges. And challenges do something remarkable to the human mind. They shift the motivation from outcome to self-assertion. Now the action is no longer about the thing itself. It's about proving something. Proving independence. Proving capability. Proving that no one decides for you. Once pride is involved, logic becomes optional. The mind is no longer asking, "Is this good for me?" It is asking, "Who do they think they are to limit me?" Reverse psychology feeds that question and then steps back. The ego rushes in to answer it with action. This is why people often act against their own stated preferences. Not because they changed their mind, but because their emotional priority shifted. Freedom became more important than comfort. Defiance became more important than desire. The irony is painful. In trying to assert control, the mind becomes predictable. Reverse psychology does not force behavior. It narrows emotional options until resistance becomes the most attractive path. And because the action feels self-generated, the person defends it fiercely afterward. They rewrite their reasons. They rationalize. They claim ownership. The ego does not like admitting it was provoked, so it lies to itself. This is the quiet power behind reverse psychology. It doesn't just influence behavior. It recruits the mind to justify the influence after the fact. Once justification begins, the illusion is complete. You don't feel guided. You feel decisive. And that feeling is the lever everything else will build on. The power of implied limits. Nothing activates desire faster than a boundary. Not a wall. Not a rule. A suggestion of restriction. The human mind is deeply suspicious of limits, especially vague ones. When something is clearly forbidden, resistance has shape. But when a limit is implied rather than enforced, the mind fills in the gap itself. And what it imagines is often more powerful than reality. Reverse psychology relies heavily on this mechanism. It does not say, "You can't do this." It says, "This probably isn't for you." That single shift changes everything. The statement carries no authority, no threat, no force. It sounds almost respectful, almost dismissive. And dismissal is far more provocative than opposition. Being told no can feel oppressive. Being quietly excluded feels personal. The mind interprets exclusion as a challenge to status. And status is inseparable from ego. Once status is threatened, curiosity turns into desire. What do they know that I don't? Why wouldn't this be for me? What makes them think I couldn't handle it? These questions are not neutral. They pull attention forward. Scarcity amplifies this pull. When something appears limited, selective, or reserved for a certain type of person, the mind assigns it higher value automatically. This is not a learned behavior. It is evolutionary. Scarce resources once meant survival. So the mind leans in. Reverse psychology uses this instinct by implying that access is conditional. Not based on rules, but on identity. This takes discipline. This isn't for beginners. This requires a certain mindset. These phrases do not exclude outright. They invite self-comparison. And comparison activates insecurity. Insecurity does not weaken desire. It sharpens it. Now the action is no longer about the thing itself. It is about proving eligibility. The mind wants to cross the invisible line, not because the reward is clear, but because the boundary exists. This is why reverse psychology works so well on high achievers, skeptics, and independent thinkers. These identities are built around capability and discernment, suggesting limitation pokes directly at their self-image. You wouldn't like this. You're probably not the type. The ego cannot ignore that. What follows is a quiet escalation. The person begins thinking about the thing more often, imagining themselves engaging with it, testing arguments internally. No one told them to do this. That is the genius. The boundary did the work. Another layer of implied limits is social proof in reverse. Instead of saying, everyone is doing this, reverse psychology suggests, most people don't. This flips the signal. Suddenly, participation feels distinguishing rather than conformist. The action feels like separation from the crowd, even if the crowd is imaginary. The mind loves distinction. Distinct choices feel autonomous. Autonomous choices feel authentic. And authenticity feels good. So the person steps forward. Once they do, something subtle happens. The implied limit disappears. The door was never locked. But now that they've crossed the threshold, they feel ownership. They weren't pushed. They weren't persuaded. They chose. Or so it feels. Reverse psychology doesn't force entry. It frames entry as self-initiation. And once someone initiates themselves, commitment deepens. They are no longer responding to influence. They are defending a self-image. I'm the kind of person who does this. I'm not easily discouraged. I decide for myself. These statements solidify identity. At this point, influence has already succeeded, not by telling the person what to do, but by letting the ego do it on its own. Denial, hesitation, and the pull of withdrawal. There is a moment in every influence attempt where silence becomes louder than speech, where saying less does more. Reverse psychology reaches one of its most effective forms not when something is suggested, but when it is withdrawn. A pause, a hesitation, a sudden lack of enthusiasm. The human mind is deeply unsettled by withdrawal, especially when it follows interest. When attention is removed without explanation, the mind searches for meaning. It fills the silence with interpretation, and interpretation creates motivation. This is why denial works so powerfully. Not denial in the obvious sense, but gentle refusal. I don't think this is a good idea. Maybe it's better if you don't. I don't want to push you. These statements appear considerate, even protective, but they introduce friction where there was none. The mind hears caution and translates it as challenge. If someone insists, resistance hardens. If someone withdraws, curiosity grows. Withdrawal shifts the power dynamic. The one who steps back appears confident, unbothered, non needy, and confidence attracts pursuit. Reverse psychology uses this imbalance. When something is offered eagerly, it feels available. When it is offered reluctantly or withdrawn, it feels valuable. The mind begins wondering why access is being restricted. What do they see that I don't? What risk are they worried about? What am I missing? These questions generate momentum. Another critical element here is delayed response. When answers are not immediate, when enthusiasm cools unexpectedly, the mind assumes there is hidden depth. Delay creates gravity. The person leans in emotionally, not because they were asked to, but because the space demands resolution. This is why strategic hesitation often produces more action than persuasion. By appearing uncertain or reserved, the influencer transfers the burden of movement onto the other person. The action becomes self-driven. Reverse psychology also leverages disappointment subtly. When someone expects encouragement and receives doubt instead, they experience a micro-threat to self-image. You don't think I can do this? You're not sure I'm ready? That feeling is sharp. And sharp feelings demand response. The ego moves to restore balance by acting. This is not manipulation through force. It is manipulation through emotional vacuum. The lack of affirmation becomes the pressure. Silence becomes a mirror. Another layer of this technique is the refusal to close the loop. Instead of resolving the conversation, the topic is left unfinished. Well, we'll see. It's up to you. Do what you think is best. These phrases sound empowering, but they do something else. They shift responsibility without releasing tension. Now the person carries the unresolved decision internally. The mind replays it, tests outcomes, imagines reactions. The thought loops. Reverse psychology thrives in loops. A clear command ends a loop. An unresolved suggestion keeps it alive. Over time, the loop becomes motivation. This is why people often act later, unexpectedly, after a conversation that seemed to go nowhere. The influence did not end when the words stopped. Continued in silence. Another powerful tactic is appearing indifferent to the outcome. When someone does not seem invested in persuading you, your defenses lower. There is no obvious agenda to resist. Indifference feels safe, and safety allows curiosity. Reverse psychology often hides behind restraint. The influencer seems to hold back, as if protecting the other person from something too intense, too demanding, or too serious. This might be too much for you. I don't want you to feel pressured. Pressure is denied, but implication remains. The mind senses importance beneath the restraint. Once again, ego steps forward. The person does not want to be protected. They want to be capable. So they act. By now, the pattern should be clear. Reverse psychology does not move people by pulling them forward. It steps back and lets their own momentum take over. The person experiences themselves as the driver. The influence remains invisible. And because the action feels voluntary, it feels justified. Justification is the final seal. Once someone justifies their behavior internally, influence becomes memory rather than force. The mind edits the story to preserve autonomy. I wanted this. I decided on my own. This was my choice. These statements are not lies. They are incomplete truths. Reverse psychology does not eliminate choice. It frames it. By controlling the emotional terrain rather than the instruction, it lets the ego walk exactly where it was quietly guided. When resistance turns into commitment, there is a final transformation that makes reverse psychology so effective. Resistance does not disappear. It evolves. What began as defiance slowly becomes ownership. The person who once pushed back now stands in defense of the very action they were subtly guided toward. Not because they were convinced, because they committed. Commitment changes how the mind remembers. Once you take action, your brain rewrites the story to protect coherence. It does not like inconsistency. It does not like the idea that you acted without full control. So it fills in reasons. I wanted this. This aligns with who I am. This makes sense for me. The original provocation fades from memory. What remains is identity. Reverse psychology succeeds most completely when the person forgets there was ever an alternative. The action is no longer something they did. It becomes something they are. This is the point of no return. At this stage, the mind is no longer resisting influence. It is defending a self-image. And defending identity is far more powerful than defending an opinion. Opinions can change. Identity fights back. The person now explains the choice to others, justifies it, encourages it, sometimes even promotes it. What began as a reaction becomes advocacy. This is how influence spreads without instruction. One person's ego becomes another person's example. Another subtle shift happens here. The emotional charge that once drove resistance settles into certainty. The urgency fades. The decision feels obvious in hindsight. That was the right move. I don't know why I hesitated. This hindsight is misleading. The hesitation mattered. The resistance mattered. That friction was the lever that moved everything. But the mind erases friction once coherence is restored. Reverse psychology counts on this erasure. Another important element is sunk cost. Time, effort, and emotion have now been invested. Walking away would mean admitting misjudgment. The mind avoids that pain, so it doubles down. Even if doubts surface, they are softened, reinterpreted, pushed aside. Nothing's perfect. There are trade-offs. At least I chose. Choice becomes the justification, not the outcome. This is the final irony. Reverse psychology gives people the feeling of choice so strong that they will defend the result even if it no longer serves them. Freedom becomes the narrative. But the path was still guided. This doesn't mean the person was powerless. It means the mind prioritizes autonomy over accuracy. Feeling in control matters more than being correct. Once you understand this, a larger pattern emerges. You begin to see how often decisions are made not because something is best, but because it protects self-image. How often resistance is less about disagreement and more about dignity. Reverse psychology does not exploit stupidity. It exploits pride. And pride is not a flaw. It is a survival instinct. Protects agency. Protects selfhood. But when pride is provoked deliberately, it becomes predictable. The final seal of influence is silence. No reminders. No pressure. No reinforcement needed. The person continues on their own. That is when reverse psychology ends its work, and when its effects truly begin. Season 1 ends here. What you've seen so far is not a list of tricks. It is a map of the human ego under pressure. A demonstration of how easily independence can be redirected without ever being denied. In the next season, the focus will shift, not to how resistance is triggered, but to how it is used repeatedly in relationships, leadership, media, and everyday power dynamics until people mistake reaction for identity. How reverse psychology becomes a system, not a trick. Reverse psychology is often described as a tactic. Clever move, a conversational trick. Something used once in the moment to push behavior in a specific direction. That description is comforting, because it suggests containment. But in the real world, reverse psychology rarely appears as a single act. It operates as a system, a repeating pattern that reshapes behavior over time until resistance itself becomes predictable. And once resistance is predictable, it is usable. The mistake most people make is assuming influence happens only during direct interaction. In truth, the most effective influence happens between interactions. In the quiet accumulation of expectations, emotional habits, and unspoken rules. Reverse psychology becomes systemic when people learn how someone reacts to pressure and then design the environment around that reaction. You are no longer persuaded. You are managed. Consider how this appears in everyday relationships. A person notices that when they push, you resist. So they stop pushing. They begin expressing doubt instead of desire. They lower expectations verbally while maintaining emotional cues that signal importance. They don't tell you what to do. They create conditions where you feel compelled to decide. Over time, this becomes the norm. You begin to associate initiative with independence, action with pride, hesitation with weakness. No one needs to guide you anymore. You guide yourself. This is where reverse psychology shifts from influence into structure. The environment now anticipates your reactions. This is why systems of power often appear hands-off. They don't micromanage. They don't issue constant orders. They rely on predictable resistance patterns baked into human psychology. Rules are written loosely. Expectations are implied rather than enforced. Authority appears distant, reasonable, even permissive, and yet behavior remains tightly constrained. The system does not say, "You must." It says, "You're free." But freedom is framed in such a way that only certain choices feel dignified. This is how reverse psychology scales. In workplaces, leadership often learns that direct commands provoke resentment. So instead, goals are framed as opportunities. Expectations are presented as optional. Pressure is disguised as trust. We're not asking you to. It's up to you. But the people who succeed usually, the sentence never finishes. It doesn't need to. The implication does the work. Now the employee is not responding to authority. They are responding to identity. They are proving something to themselves. Over time, workload increases without orders. Boundaries erode without conflict. Burnout grows under the banner of self-motivation. Reverse psychology has become operational. In media and culture, the same pattern appears. Audiences resist obvious messaging, so messaging becomes indirect. Narratives do not tell people what to believe. They imply what kind of person believes what. Beliefs become personality traits. If you agree, you are insightful. If you disagree, you are naive. If you hesitate, you are behind. No one forces alignment. People align to avoid feeling diminished. This is reverse psychology at scale. The system does not demand obedience. It rewards defiance in carefully controlled directions. It encourages rebellion that leads exactly where it wants. You're not like the others. You think for yourself. You see through the lies. These phrases feel liberating. But liberation offered by a system is rarely freedom. It is a role. Once you accept the role, behavior follows. The most unsettling part is how invisible this becomes to the person inside it. They feel independent. They feel skeptical. They feel above manipulation. That self-perception becomes armor. Anyone who challenges the system now appears as the manipulator. You're trying to control me. You're telling me what to think. The irony is complete. Reverse psychology has flipped perception itself. Another key element of systemic reverse psychology is timing. Pressure is applied not when the person is strong, but when they are uncertain. when identity is in flux, when decisions feel urgent. Moments of transition are ideal. Career shifts, relationship changes, moral uncertainty, cultural anxiety. During these moments, people are hypersensitive to autonomy. They want to feel in control when they feel least stable. Reverse psychology thrives here. The system does not offer answers. It offers reactions. It lets people push against something vague. An idea, a threat, a stereotype, a they. That push gives direction to anxiety. Direction feels like relief, and relief creates loyalty. Over time, people stop noticing how often their choices are framed as reactions. They stop asking what they actually want. They ask what they don't want to be seen as. This is the key shift. When identity becomes reactive, autonomy is compromised. You are no longer choosing from values. You are choosing against implications, against shame, against weakness, against exclusion. Reverse psychology systems maintain control by keeping those implications alive. Not loudly, subtly, through tone, through comparison, through silence. Eventually, the system no longer needs active influence. People internalize the rules. They know which choices feel strong, which feel embarrassing, which feel worthy of respect. No one needs to tell them. This is how reverse psychology becomes culture. It stops being a tactic used by someone. It becomes the air everyone breathes. And once influence is atmospheric, resisting it feels like suffocating. The most important realization is this: systems that rely on reverse psychology do not collapse when exposed. They collapse when people stop defining themselves through reaction. When people begin choosing based on alignment rather than defiance. When pride stops being the primary motivator. This is difficult, because pride feels like strength. But pride driven by opposition is fragile. It requires an enemy, provocation, a boundary to push against. True autonomy does not need resistance. It does not need to prove itself. Simply acts. How resistance is cultivated and then harvested. There is a subtle difference between resistance that arises naturally and resistance that is cultivated. Natural resistance protects autonomy. Cultivated resistance is predictable, and predictability is power. Once a system understands how and when you resist, it no longer needs to suppress you. It only needs to wait, or better, to gently provoke. The cultivation of resistance begins with pattern recognition. Over time, people reveal how they push back. Some resist authority. Some resist pressure. Some resist consensus. Some resist emotional intensity. These patterns are not hidden. They are performed repeatedly, and systems learn. Once learned, resistance is no longer a problem. It becomes a resource. Instead of fighting resistance, influence moves around it. It frames options so that resistance points in a useful direction. This is why some environments feel permissive but never truly open. You are allowed to resist, but only within lanes that lead somewhere specific. You can disagree, but only in predictable ways. You can rebel, but only against approved targets. You can question, but not foundational assumptions. The system does not silence dissent. It channels it. Reverse psychology thrives here by creating safe enemies. Concepts, ideas, or groups that are easy to oppose without threatening the core structure. People feel bold, critical, independent, but the structure remains untouched. This is how resistance becomes performative rather than transformative. Another important element is the illusion of choice. Multiple options are presented, all framed as alternatives to control. You can choose A or B. You don't have to follow this. It's totally up to you. But the framing ensures that choosing outside the set feels irrational, extreme, or socially costly. Resistance becomes cosmetic. You choose against pressure, but still within bounds. Over time, people begin equating choice with autonomy, even when the range of choice is tightly constrained. The feeling of resistance replaces the reality of freedom. Reverse psychology doesn't need to eliminate your will. It only needs to occupy it. Another mechanism here is anticipation. Once people know they are being watched, even abstractly, they begin preemptively resisting or aligning. I don't want to seem controlled. I don't want to be predictable. I don't want to look naive. These thoughts guide behavior before any influence is applied. The system no longer acts first. You do. This is how resistance becomes self-initiated. At this stage, people mistake their reactions for insight. They believe pushing back proves intelligence. That skepticism itself guarantees truth. But skepticism without reflection is just inversion. It flips the signal without examining it. Reverse psychology systems love inversion because it looks like thinking while avoiding it. You oppose what is obvious, not what is structural. The system remains invisible. Another layer is emotional reward. Resistance is often praised, liked, validated, especially when it aligns with group identity. You're not afraid to speak up. You don't just follow the crowd. You see through the nonsense. These affirmations reinforce resistance as identity. Once resistance becomes identity, it becomes predictable again. Now the system knows exactly how to engage you, not by commanding, but by challenging, by doubting, by withdrawing. Every move is calibrated to trigger your reflex. At this point, resistance is no longer a defense. It is a handle. The most dangerous part is that people often feel most free at this stage. They feel awake, unmanipulated, hard to influence. That confidence becomes armor. Anyone who questions the structure is dismissed as controlling. Anyone who challenges the narrative is framed as authoritarian. Reverse psychology has inverted perception itself. Control looks like guidance. Guidance looks like control. This confusion is not accidental. Keeps people busy reacting instead of observing. Another crucial feature is fatigue. Constant resistance is exhausting. Over time, people burn out. Their skepticism dulls. Their energy drops. When fatigue sets in, resistance becomes automatic rather than intentional. People push back reflexively without thinking. This makes them even easier to guide. The system no longer needs to provoke strongly. Small cues are enough. A tone, a pause, a phrase, reaction follows. Undoing this requires something counterintuitive. Not more resistance, but less reaction. The way out is not opposing harder. It is slowing down enough to notice when resistance is being anticipated. Asking, why does this feel like a challenge? Who benefits from my reaction? What happens if I don't push back? These questions feel disempowering at first because resistance feels like strength. But strength rooted in reaction is fragile. True autonomy is quieter. It does not need an enemy. It does not need to prove itself. It does not need to be seen. When resistance becomes optional rather than reflexive, systems lose leverage. They can no longer predict you, and unpredictability is freedom. When relationships become levers instead of bonds, the most powerful influence in your life rarely comes from strangers. It comes from people who know you, people who understand your rhythms, your insecurities, your pride. your need to feel respected, chosen, and seen. This is where reverse psychology stops looking like strategy and starts looking like love, care, or concern. And that's what makes it dangerous. In close relationships, influence doesn't need to announce itself. It lives in tone, in timing, in what is encouraged and what is quietly withheld. A raised eyebrow, pause after you speak, a change in warmth. These signals are small, but the mind reads them instantly. Human connection trains us to be sensitive to emotional shifts. Long before language, survival depended on noticing when bonds cooled or strengthened. That sensitivity never left. Reverse psychology in relationships exploits it, not by demanding change, but by rearranging emotional gravity. Approval becomes conditional. Distance becomes instructional. Affection becomes selective. And none of it needs to be explicit. The most common pattern looks harmless at first. You express an opinion. The other person doesn't argue. They simply pull back a little. Less enthusiasm. Less engagement. Less warmth. Nothing confrontational enough to push against, but enough to be felt. The mind reacts immediately. What did I do? Did I say something wrong? Should I have said that differently? These questions appear automatically. Reverse psychology works here by letting you do the correcting. No one tells you to change. You adjust yourself. Over time, certain thoughts are expressed less. Certain desires are softened. Certain boundaries are rephrased. Not because you were forced, because you want the bond to feel stable again. This is how relationships become levers. Not through cruelty, through subtle emotional economics. Warmth rewards alignment. Distance punishes divergence. Another variation appears as concern. I just don't want you to regret this. I'm worried this isn't really you. I know you, and this doesn't feel right. These statements sound caring. Sometimes they are. But they also plant doubt. Not about the decision, about yourself. Reverse psychology here reframes autonomy as impulsiveness, independence as immaturity, choice as lack of self-awareness. Now the ego is trapped. If you proceed, you appear reckless. If you stop, you prove them right. Either way, their framing dominates. This is especially powerful in relationships with unequal emotional investment. Parents, mentors, partners, close friends. The closer the bond, the less resistance is needed. You don't want to disappoint. You don't want to hurt them. You don't want to be misunderstood. So you hesitate. That hesitation is influence. Another layer appears when someone expects you to resist. They anticipate your pushback and preempt it. I know you hate being told what to do. I'm not trying to control you. This is totally your decision. These statements lower defenses while still shaping the emotional frame. Now, if you resist, you feel predictable, childish, exactly as expected. So you don't. Reverse psychology has neutralized resistance by naming it. Another subtle technique is reversal of roles. The other person presents themselves as restrained, cautious, even weak. I don't want to get in your way. I'm probably overthinking this. It's not my place to say. This makes you the powerful one, and power wants to act. You step forward to assert clarity, confidence, leadership, but the direction was still framed. The choice still guided. In relationships, reverse psychology often masquerades as respect. And because it feels respectful, it bypasses scrutiny. The most damaging version appears when love becomes proof. If you cared, you'd understand. If this mattered to you, you wouldn't hesitate. I thought we were on the same page. Now disagreement is reframed as betrayal, not because of content, but because of connection. This is not manipulation in the cartoon sense. It's emotional gravity. The bond itself becomes the pressure. And because the bond matters, the influence is internalized. Over time, people in these dynamics lose clarity about where their desires end and accommodation begins. They still feel autonomous, but their autonomy is reactive. They choose to preserve harmony rather than pursue alignment. This does not happen all at once. It happens through small adjustments, tone softening, opinions reworded, goals delayed, preferences muted. Each change feels reasonable in isolation. Together, they form self-editing. Reverse psychology succeeds when you begin filtering yourself before anyone else has to. Another deeply unsettling aspect is how this dynamic persists even without malice. Many people use reverse psychology unconsciously. They learn what produces closeness and what produces distance, and they repeat it. The relationship trains both sides. No villain is required. That makes it harder to name. But naming it is essential. The way out is not confrontation, not accusation, not cold withdrawal. It is clarity. Clarity about what you feel when warmth disappears. Clarity about which choices bring relief rather than alignment. Clarity about whether your autonomy feels expanded or narrowed over time. Healthy relationships can tolerate difference. They do not require you to shrink to stay connected. If connection depends on predictability, it is fragile. If affection depends on agreement, it is conditional. Reverse psychology collapses in relationships when people stop treating emotional withdrawal as information about truth. Distance does not mean you are wrong. Silence does not mean you failed. Discomfort does not mean you should change. Sometimes it only means the bond is being used as a lever. When you stop responding automatically to that lever, something shifts. The relationship must adapt, or reveal its limits. When authority feels optional but isn't the most durable, authority does not look authoritarian. It looks reasonable, relaxed, almost absent. This is not accidental. Direct control provokes resistance. Visible power invites challenge. So modern authority learns to disappear just enough to remain unquestioned. Reverse psychology is one of its favorite tools. Instead of commanding obedience, authority frames itself as permissive. It speaks in suggestions, options, and personal responsibility. You're free to decide. We trust your judgment. No one is forcing you. These statements feel empowering, but they quietly shift the burden of outcomes onto the individual. If things go well, the system is validated. If things go wrong, the choice was yours. Authority remains intact either way. This is how obedience is redesigned as self-direction. In these systems, rules exist, but they are softened. Enforcement is inconsistent. Expectations are implied rather than declared. This ambiguity is strategic. Clear rules invite defiance. Ambiguous norms invite self-policing. People begin monitoring themselves more carefully than any external authority ever could. They anticipate expectations. They correct behavior preemptively. Not because they were ordered to, because they don't want to seem irresponsible, uncommitted, or difficult. Reverse psychology turns accountability inward. Another layer appears in how dissent is handled. Instead of being punished, it is acknowledged politely and then ignored. We hear your concerns. That's an interesting perspective. Noted. These responses diffuse resistance without addressing it. The dissenter feels seen, but nothing changes. Over time, people learn that pushing harder brings no effect. Resistance loses momentum. Compliance becomes the path of least friction. Authority never had to say no. It just waited. Another tactic is selective validation. Authority praises independent thinking, but only when it leads to approved conclusions. We value critical thinkers. We encourage debate, but only within boundaries. Those who question surface-level issues are rewarded. Those who question structural foundations are framed as disruptive or unrealistic. You're overcomplicating things. This isn't productive. We need to be pragmatic. Pragmatism becomes the moral shield. Reverse psychology here works by redefining rebellion. True rebellion becomes impractical, pointless, immature, while compliance is reframed as wisdom. The rebel is no longer the hero. The cooperative skeptic is. Another powerful move is delayed consequence. When authority allows small deviations without response, people feel free. Then consequences appear later, disconnected from the original action. This breaks causal clarity. People stop knowing what triggers consequences, so they err on the side of caution. They restrict themselves more than required. Uncertainty becomes control. Reverse psychology also operates through comparison. Authority highlights examples of people who chose wisely without explicitly instructing anyone else to follow. Some people really stepped up. Others took a different path. No judgment is spoken, but everyone hears it. Now obedience feels like self-respect. Disobedience feels like self-sabotage. The most effective authorities understand this. People don't want to be controlled, but they desperately want to feel competent. Reverse psychology frames compliance as competence. You handled this well. You showed maturity. You made the responsible call. These compliments do not reference obedience. They reference identity. Once obedience becomes identity, authority no longer needs to act. People align themselves. The most unsettling part is that this often feels like progress. Less force, more freedom, more trust. But freedom without transparency is not freedom. It is management. Reverse psychology in authority systems does not remove power. It redistributes perception of power. Power becomes invisible, and invisible power is hardest to resist. Undoing this requires distinguishing between choice and responsibility framing. Ask yourself, would this choice feel the same without praise? Would refusal feel shameful? Is responsibility being shared or shifted? True authority can tolerate refusal without moralizing it. It does not require you to feel proud of compliance. When pride is attached to obedience, autonomy is already compromised. The way out is not defiance. It is clarity. Clarity about where choice ends and expectation begins. Clarity about when freedom is conditional. Clarity about whose interests are served by your independence. Reverse psychology collapses when authority is named rather than internalized. When influence feels like discovery, not persuasion. The most effective influence never tells you what to believe. It lets you believe you found it yourself. This is where reverse psychology reaches its most refined form. Not in arguments, not in authority, but in stories, in narratives that invite curiosity rather than compliance. You are not instructed. You are led. Media rarely says, "Think this." It says, "Notice this." Have you ever wondered? What if everything you were told was incomplete? These questions feel liberating. They position you as an explorer rather than a follower. Someone uncovering hidden layers of reality. And explorers don't like being guided. They like discovering. Reverse psychology understands this and builds narratives that reward skepticism in specific directions. Doubt is encouraged, but only toward selected targets. Curiosity is praised, but only within curated boundaries. The viewer feels sharp, awake, independent. That feeling is the hook. Once hooked, the narrative unfolds gradually. It withholds conclusions. It gestures toward implications. It lets the audience connect dots that were carefully placed. This is not accidental. When people arrive at conclusions themselves, those conclusions feel personal, earned, protected. No one wants to abandon something they discovered. Reverse psychology in media often works by presenting fragments, incomplete information, suggestive patterns, emotional cues without explicit claims. The mind hates incompletion. It fills gaps instinctively, and the conclusions it reaches feel like insight. This is why narrative-based influence is more powerful than direct messaging. It does not argue. It frames perception. Once perception shifts, belief follows naturally. Another layer of this mechanism is contrast. Media often presents two extremes and lets the audience reject one to feel intelligent. But the alternative offered is still controlled. You feel like you rejected manipulation, but only the obvious version. Subtler influence remains untouched. This creates the illusion of immunity. I don't fall for propaganda. I think for myself. I see through this stuff. Those statements are rarely true in absolute terms, but believing them makes influence easier. Reverse psychology thrives on self-confidence. Another powerful tactic is the use of anti-messaging. Content that appears to criticize persuasion, manipulation, or control, while quietly guiding the audience toward new alignments. You're being lied to. They don't want you to know this. This isn't what the mainstream says. These phrases feel rebellious. They also reposition authority. The storyteller becomes the guide. The audience becomes the initiated. Now influence is framed as liberation. Leaving the narrative feels like returning to ignorance. This is not persuasion. It is identity induction. Another subtle layer is pacing. Media that slows down, that feels thoughtful, serious, and restrained lowers defenses. It does not rush to convince. It waits. Waiting signals confidence. Confidence invites trust. Once trust forms, the audience follows emotional cues rather than arguments. Tone matters more than evidence. Mood matters more than logic. Reverse psychology operates in tone. Calm voice feels honest. A hesitant pause feels sincere. A lack of certainty feels authentic. Authenticity disarms skepticism. The viewer stops asking, "Is this true?" They start asking, "Why does this feel right?" Feeling replaces evaluation. Another technique is framing belief as courage. The narrative suggests that accepting certain ideas requires bravery, that most people can't handle them. You're ready for this. Others aren't. This isn't for everyone. Exclusivity returns. Now belief feels like strength. Abandoning it feels like weakness. Reverse psychology in media rarely ends with a conclusion. It leaves space, ambiguity, an open door. The audience is invited to continue thinking, researching, sharing. They carry the narrative forward themselves. This is the final step. Influence no longer needs a source. It becomes self-propagating. Undoing this requires slowing down not just content consumption, but emotional response. Ask, what emotions does this reward? What identity does this flatter? What opposition does it assume? True discovery survives scrutiny. Manipulated discovery resists it. The difference is subtle, but it is there. When you become the one applying the pressure, the most effective influence eventually stops coming from outside. It moves in. At some point, the voice that challenges you, doubts you, restrains you, or provokes you is no longer someone else's. It becomes your own. This is where reverse psychology reaches its deepest level. You no longer need to be guided. You no longer need to be challenged. You no longer need to be provoked. You do it to yourself. Internalized reverse psychology begins when external pressure has been repeated often enough that the mind learns the pattern. It anticipates resistance, shame, pride, and validation before they arrive. The system is no longer needed. You've memorized it. You begin speaking to yourself in the same language that once moved you. You shouldn't want that. That's probably not for you. Do you really think you can handle this? These thoughts feel personal, honest, even responsible, but they are rehearsed. They echo earlier voices, past reactions, learned emotional consequences. What once came from others now comes from within. This is not coincidence. The brain is a prediction machine. It learns what thoughts lead to discomfort and which lead to relief. Over time, it preemptively applies pressure to avoid pain. You start editing yourself before acting, before you choose, before you speak, before you even desire. This is not self-control. It is internalized influence. Reverse psychology thrives here because the ego still believes it is acting freely. You are not being told what to do. You are being realistic, being mature, being disciplined. But notice the structure. The pressure does not say, do this. It says, you shouldn't want that. That is reverse psychology turned inward. Instead of pushing you forward, it blocks certain paths until the only remaining options feel like choice. You avoid things not because you evaluated them, but because wanting them feels embarrassing, naive, risky, beneath you. Pride has been internalized. Another layer appears as self-challenge. I'll prove I don't need this. I'll show I'm above that. I don't care anyway. These statements feel strong. But strength rooted in denial is still reaction. You are still orienting yourself against an imagined judgment. Even when no one is watching. This is how reverse psychology turns into self-surveillance. You begin monitoring your own impulses as if they were suspect. Certain desires are immediately questioned. Certain ambitions are framed as unrealistic. Certain emotions are dismissed as weakness. Not because you reasoned it out, because that reaction was rewarded in the past. Relief followed restraint. Approval followed denial. Stability followed suppression. The mind learned. Another form of internalized reverse psychology appears as delayed permission. Maybe later. Not now. When I'm ready. These phrases sound patient, but often they function as quiet avoidance. The desire is acknowledged just enough to neutralize urgency, then postponed indefinitely. No confrontation needed. The pressure remains invisible. Over time, postponed desires fade. Not because they were wrong, but because they were never acted on. This is influence without conflict. Another unsettling aspect is how internalized reverse psychology disguises itself as wisdom. You tell yourself you've outgrown certain wants, that you're more rational now, less impulsive, more grounded. Sometimes this is true. Sometimes it's just accommodation. Accommodation to an environment that punished wanting too much, choosing differently, or stepping outside invisible limits. The mind reframes limitation as maturity. This makes influence feel virtuous. The most dangerous part is that self-applied reverse psychology is extremely hard to detect. There is no external pressure to resist, no obvious manipulator to point to. The voice feels like you. Undoing this begins with noticing emotional tone. When you think about a choice, do you feel curiosity or contraction? When you imagine pursuing something, do you feel energy or shame? When you hesitate, does it feel thoughtful or defensive? Defensive hesitation is often learned. It carries the emotional signature of past pressure. Another key signal is how often your reasoning begins with what you don't want to be seen as. I don't want to look desperate. I don't want to seem naive. I don't want to be that person. These are not values. They are reactions. Reverse psychology trains people to define themselves by negation rather than intention, by what they avoid rather than what they align with. Over time, this hollows desire. You become skilled at restraint but unclear about direction, stable but stagnant. This is not autonomy. It is containment without walls. The way out is not indulgence or rebellion. It is curiosity. Curiosity about your own resistance. Why does this feel off limits? Whose voice does this hesitation resemble? What would I choose if no one were watching, judging, or remembering? These questions feel risky because they reintroduce desire. And desire makes you vulnerable. But vulnerability is where authorship lives. Internalized reverse psychology collapses when you stop treating every impulse as a threat to identity. When you allow wanting without immediately correcting it. You don't have to act on every desire. You just have to let it exist without shame. That alone loosens the grip. Discipline, self-control, and the quiet war with desire. There is a version of reverse psychology that wears the mask of discipline. It sounds responsible, controlled, even admirable. This is where people begin using resistance against themselves in the name of productivity, strength, and self-mastery. And this is where the line quietly blurs. At first, it looks like motivation. You don't need rest. You shouldn't want comfort. Push through it. These statements feel empowering. They frame desire as weakness and restraint as virtue. The mind learns to provoke itself by denying relief. Reverse psychology turns inward. You tell yourself you don't want the break. You convince yourself you're above the reward. You frame exhaustion as proof of commitment. And it works. For a while. This self-provocation creates momentum. The ego resists softness. It wants to prove resilience. It wants to show control. So you act. You work longer. You rest less. You suppress hesitation. The action feels earned because it was difficult. But difficulty alone is not meaning. Reverse psychology becomes destructive here because discipline stops serving intention and starts serving identity. You are no longer acting because the work matters. You are acting because stopping would feel like failure. This is the quiet shift. Discipline rooted in values feels aligned. Discipline rooted in resistance feels tense. One builds capacity. The other builds pressure. Self-applied reverse psychology often frames rest, ease, or joy as indulgence, as something to be earned later, always later, not yet, after this, when I deserve it. The reward keeps moving. This keeps the ego engaged. You are always almost enough. This pattern looks productive from the outside, but internally it feels brittle. Joy becomes conditional. Satisfaction becomes rare. The mind is constantly pushing against itself. This internal conflict is exhausting, and exhaustion dulls awareness. Reverse psychology thrives on fatigue. Another form appears as self-denial disguised as maturity. You stop wanting things openly. You frame ambition as childish, desire as distraction, hope as unrealistic. I'm just being practical. I'm past that stage. That's not important anymore. Sometimes this is wisdom. Sometimes it's retreat. The difference is emotional tone. Wisdom feels calm. Retreat feels tight. When reverse psychology governs discipline, self-control feels like suppression rather than choice. You don't choose not to rest. You feel guilty resting. You don't choose not to want. You feel embarrassed wanting. This guilt keeps behavior predictable. You remain disciplined even when the discipline no longer serves you. Another layer of this is comparison. You provoke yourself by imagining others who are more productive, more focused, more relentless. They're not slowing down. They're not complaining. They're tougher than this. This imagined audience keeps pressure alive. Even when no one is watching. Reverse psychology replaces encouragement with provocation. Instead of asking what would support growth, you ask what would prove strength. Proof replaces purpose. This is dangerous because proof has no endpoint. You can always push harder, deny more, sacrifice further. Eventually, the system consumes itself. Burnout is not laziness. It is prolonged resistance turned inward. The mind cannot remain in opposition forever without collapsing. And when collapse comes, it feels like failure. But it isn't. It is feedback. Undoing this form of internalized reverse psychology requires redefining discipline. Discipline is not the ability to resist desire. It is the ability to choose intentionally. Sometimes the discipline choice is rest. Sometimes it is stopping. Sometimes it is wanting something fully. The key question is not, can I deny this? It is, does denying this align with what I actually value? When discipline serves values, it feels grounded. When it serves identity defense, it feels rigid. Another important step is noticing language. If your inner dialogue relies heavily on shame, comparison, or self-challenge, you are likely provoking yourself rather than guiding yourself. Guidance feels supportive. Provocation feels harsh. Reverse psychology thrives in harshness. Replacing provocation with clarity is not weakness. It is maturity. You do not need to trick yourself into acting. If you do, something is misaligned. True motivation does not require self-confrontation. It requires meaning that is chosen, not enforced. When you stop treating desire as an enemy, discipline becomes sustainable. It no longer relies on resistance. And without resistance, reverse psychology loses its grip. When self-image is built on opposition at some point, reverse psychology stops shaping what you do. It starts shaping who you think you are. This is where influence becomes identity. Many people believe their self-image is formed through values, achievements, or character. But just as often, it is formed through opposition. Through what they refuse, what they reject, what they distance themselves from. I'm not needy. I'm not emotional. I'm not like them. These statements sound confident, but they are reactive. A self-image built on opposition is always looking over its shoulder. It requires a contrast to exist, an imagined weakness to stand against, an inferior version of the self to avoid becoming. Reverse psychology feeds this construction quietly. Instead of telling you who to be, it teaches you who not to be. It rewards restraint, detachment, toughness, and emotional distance. Over time, these traits stop being strategies and start being personality. You don't just act composed. You are composed. You don't just avoid vulnerability. You are someone who doesn't need it. This identity feels strong. But strength defined by negation is fragile, because it depends on constant resistance. The moment you feel softness, doubt, longing, or uncertainty, the identity is threatened. So those experiences are pushed away, reframed, or mocked internally. I don't care. That's beneath me. I'm past that. These are not neutral observations. They are defenses. Reverse psychology turns self-image into a guardrail. It keeps you within a narrow emotional range where you feel competent and in control. Outside that range, shame waits. Another way this shows up is confidence built on distance. You feel confident not because you are deeply secure, but because you stay detached. You don't invest fully. You don't risk exposure. If nothing matters too much, nothing can hurt you. This looks like confidence, but it is actually insulation. Reverse psychology thrives here because it teaches people that needing, caring, or hoping too openly is a loss of power. Independence becomes emotional minimalism. You pride yourself on not reacting. But inside, reactions are simply delayed. Another subtle pattern appears when self-image is tied to being hard to influence. I don't fall for things. I'm not easily impressed. I see through people. These statements feel intelligent, but they can become cages. You start rejecting experiences, ideas, or connections not because they are wrong, but because accepting them would contradict your self-story. Curiosity becomes risky. Enjoyment becomes suspicious. You don't want to appear influenced, so you remain distant. Reverse psychology loves this version of confidence because it prevents genuine engagement. You stay reactive, but convince yourself you're above reaction. The ego stays intact. Growth stalls. Another layer involves moral superiority. You define yourself as more disciplined, more realistic, more rational than others. This comparison reinforces identity. But it also narrows empathy. People who act differently are dismissed. Their joy seems naive. Their passion seems foolish. Their vulnerability seems weak. This keeps your self-image stable. But it also keeps you isolated. Reverse psychology doesn't need to isolate you physically. It isolates you internally. Undoing this requires asking uncomfortable questions. Is my confidence expansive or restrictive? Does my self-image allow me to grow or only to defend? Do I choose restraint or do I fear exposure? True confidence does not require constant contrast. It does not need to prove itself by rejecting things. Can say yes without losing dignity. Can say no without contempt. Reverse psychology loses power when self-image is rooted in values rather than opposition. When identity is defined by what you move toward, not what you avoid. That shift is quiet, but it changes everything. Protecting the story you tell yourself. Every person lives inside a story. Not a dramatic one. Not a fictional one. A quiet narrative that explains who they are, why they act the way they do, and what kind of person they believe themselves to be. This story is not written all at once. It forms gradually, shaped by past choices, reactions, and the emotional consequences that followed them. And once the story exists, the mind works to protect it. Reverse psychology becomes powerful here because it does not attack the story directly. It challenges it just enough to provoke defense. You feel pressure not on a belief but on who you think you are. I'm not that kind of person. I don't act like that. That's not me. These thoughts appear instantly, before reflection. The self-story has spoken. This is where internalized reverse psychology operates most efficiently. You don't need to be persuaded or restrained. Your own identity does the work. You avoid actions that don't fit the story. You reject opportunities that might expose contradiction. You downplay desires that feel misaligned with the image you've built. Not because they are wrong, because they threaten coherence. Coherence feels safe. Even if the story is limiting, it is familiar. And familiarity is comforting. Reverse psychology thrives by making deviation feel like self-betrayal. The moment you consider doing something outside your usual pattern, discomfort appears. People would be surprised. This doesn't make sense for me. I'd be contradicting myself. The mind frames change as instability. Stability becomes the highest value. But stability is not growth. It is maintenance. Another layer appears when people use logic to defend emotional avoidance. The story becomes rationalized. I've already learned that lesson. That phase is behind me. I know better now. Sometimes this is wisdom. Sometimes it is fear wearing clarity's clothes. Reverse psychology works best when the mind believes it is choosing restraint out of intelligence rather than avoidance. The story reframes fear as discernment. This makes it nearly invisible. Another subtle mechanism is narrative pride. You take pride in having a consistent self-image, in being predictable, reliable, unchanged. I've always been this way. I don't flip-flop. I know who I am. Consistency feels strong. But consistency can also become inertia. Reverse psychology uses this pride by framing new possibilities as contradictions. You don't reject them because they're wrong. You reject them because they don't fit the narrative. Growth is misinterpreted as inconsistency. And inconsistency feels like weakness. Another deeply ingrained habit is editing memory to protect the story. Past doubts are minimized. Past desires are reframed. Past failures are justified. The narrative smooths itself. Reverse psychology benefits from this smoothing because it reduces friction. The story becomes simpler over time, less flexible, more certain. Certainty feels like confidence, but it often hides fear of revision. The most unsettling moment comes when you realize that the story you are protecting may no longer reflect who you are becoming. But letting it go feels like losing yourself. This is where many people freeze. They cling to the story not because it's true, but because it's known. Reverse psychology keeps them there by equating change with instability, immaturity, or loss of control. You'll regret this. This isn't like you. Stick to what you know. These messages no longer come from outside. They come from within. Undoing this does not require destroying your self-story. It requires loosening it, allowing it to evolve without panic. The self is not a fixed structure. It is a process, a movement. Stories are useful, but they should remain editable. The moment a story becomes untouchable, it becomes a cage. Reverse psychology loses its grip when you allow yourself to surprise yourself. When you permit inconsistency without shame. When you let curiosity exist without needing to justify it against your past. Change does not mean you were wrong before. It means you are alive now. This realization feels destabilizing at first. The old anchors loosen. The familiar self fades slightly. There is a moment of disorientation. That moment is not danger. It is freedom beginning. The moment before freedom feels like loss. There is a point where reverse psychology finally loses its grip. And almost no one talks about it, because it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like loss. When the old self-story begins to loosen, there is a strange emptiness that appears. The familiar tension disappears. The constant pushback quiets. The inner voice that once challenged, restrained, and provoked you softens. And in that silence, something unsettling happens. You don't immediately feel free. You feel unanchored. For a long time, resistance gave shape to your decisions. Pride gave you direction. Identity gave you edges. Even pressure gave you momentum. When those forces fade, there is no immediate replacement. Just space. This is the moment many people turn back. They mistake the absence of pressure for lack of purpose. They mistake uncertainty for failure. They mistake calm for stagnation. So they return to familiar reactions. They provoke themselves again. They retighten the rules. They resurrect the old story. Because at least it felt like something. Reverse psychology survives longest right here. Not because it is strong, but because freedom initially feels empty. The mind asks uncomfortable questions. If I'm not resisting, who am I? If I'm not proving anything, what drives me? If I don't define myself against something, what remains? These questions are frightening. Because the answers are not immediate. And the human mind prefers certainty, even painful certainty, over open-endedness. But this moment is not a collapse. It is a reset. For the first time, action is no longer forced by reaction. Desire is no longer filtered through shame. Choice is no longer defined by what it opposes. You are not being pushed forward. You are standing still. And standing still feels wrong to a mind trained on pressure. This is where patience matters. Not productivity. Not discipline. Not resistance. Patience. If you stay here long enough, something subtle begins to emerge. Curiosity that is not defensive. Desire that is not performative. Interest that is not trying to prove anything. You begin to notice what draws you when no one is watching. What matters when no image is at stake. What feels right without justification. This is not dramatic. It is quiet. And because it is quiet, it feels fragile. Reverse psychology collapses here because it has nothing to push against. No pride to provoke. No shame to activate. No story to defend. Cannot operate without tension. What replaces it is not certainty. It is authorship. Authorship means you are no longer reacting to pressure, even internal pressure. You are choosing from alignment. Alignment feels different from reaction. Feels slower. Less urgent. Less impressive. But more stable. You don't need to prove independence. You don't need to resist influence loudly. You don't need to protect an image. You simply act. And when you act this way, something surprising happens. You become harder to manipulate. Not because you are skeptical of everything, but because your decisions no longer depend on opposition. Reverse psychology requires a lever. When you stop giving it one, it stops working. This is the quiet end of the cycle. Not rebellion, not enlightenment, not awakening, just maturity. The kind that doesn't announce itself. For most of your life, you were taught to look for control in obvious places. Orders, rules, commands, pressure you could point to and resist. But the real force shaping your choices was rarely that loud. It lived in reactions, in pride, in the need to feel independent, in the stories you told yourself about who you are. Reverse psychology worked not because others were clever, but because the human mind is wired to protect autonomy at all costs. Even when that protection turns into a predictable pattern, you resisted what felt imposed. You chased what felt restricted. You defended what felt self-chosen. And slowly, without noticing, reaction replaced intention. At first, influence came from outside. Then it moved into systems, then into relationships, then into your own inner voice. By the end, no one had to guide you anymore. You were guiding yourself along paths you didn't consciously choose. This is the part most people never reach. Not because they are incapable, but because the moment reaction fades, there is a silence that feels unfamiliar. Without pressure, without defiance, without something to push against, the mind feels exposed. And many people mistake that exposure for emptiness. So they rebuild the old tension. They provoke themselves again. They return to resistance, pride, and identity. Because at least that felt like movement. But if you stayed long enough in that quiet space, you felt something else begin to form. A different kind of clarity. Not the sharp certainty of opposition, but the steady calm of alignment. You stopped choosing against things, and started choosing toward what mattered. Not to prove independence, not to protect an image, not to avoid looking weak or naive, but because it fit. This is where reverse psychology finally loses its power. Cannot guide someone who no longer needs to react. Cannot provoke someone who isn't defending an identity. Cannot manipulate someone who allows desire without shame and choice without performance. Freedom does not feel dramatic. It feels ordinary. You act without announcing it. You decide without needing validation. You change without explaining yourself. The world does not suddenly become fair. Influence does not disappear. Pressure still exists. But it no longer owns your direction. Because the final truth is simple. The opposite of manipulation is not resistance. It is authorship. And authorship begins the moment you stop proving who you are and start choosing how you live. Quietly, deliberately, without needing to push back at all. That is where the story ends, and where your decisions finally begin.